Well, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dimitri Baum. I am the interim dean at the University of Maine School of Law. I am excited and honored to welcome you all to the 27th annual Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. This is one of our law school signature events, one that we look forward to every year, and one that we're really extremely proud to sponsor. There are so many distinguished guests here that I can't name them all, nor do I want to try at the risk of not including some. I'm thrilled to see so many current students, recent alums, so many friends of the law school and the Coffin family. I just want to offer a special welcome to the Coffin family members. It was great to meet some of you today and all of you this evening. The numerous state and federal judges that are in the audience, the system chancellor and former governor of Connecticut, Dan Malloy, more than 24 former judicial clerks for Judge Coffin. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you all in this room. Having clerked for a judge myself, I know how close-knit the clerk community can be. The former clerk community for Judge Coffin consists of over 60 lawyers, judges, professors, civic leaders. They have worked so closely with Maine law to establish this event and help us sustain the kind of the spirit and tradition of the lecture series. So welcome and thank you all. I also want to thank former Coffin clerk Barbara Riegelhot for her work in bringing so many of the Coffin clerks together for the celebration. And I also want to thank colleagues at Maine Law who helped organize this event, Lexi Morris, Jennifer Crane, Samantha Scarf, and Nicole Vinyl. I can't tell you how amazing our staff is. We're lean but very efficient. This year, the lecture is a particularly special event, right? So not only are we in a more intimate location here at the Museum of Art, which is particularly fitting for a venue for a celebration of a Renaissance man like Judge Coffin, but we're celebrating Judge Coffin's centennial year, and this year's lecture will be focused on Judge Coffin himself. Our speaker this year is Dr. Richard Mayman, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at USM. Dr. Mayman will receive a proper introduction in just a moment by Douglas Coffin, Judge Coffin's son, which means that my role here is very limited. It is to welcome you and to introduce Douglas Coffin. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I am the interim dean. I have been coming to this event for 8 years. I've seen Peter do this introduction 3 to 4 times. I saw Danielle Conway do this 3 or 4 times. As the interim, this is my one shot, so I'm going to take a little bit longer up here and just tell you why this event is so special to me and to the law school in particular. I grew up in the former USSR and moved to the United States when I was 12. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to law school was because of my fascination with the judiciary and the kind of power and authority that we give to our judges. For those of you who didn't go to law school, we teach law through reading judicial opinions, right? When we study any kind of law, we really focus on what judges have said about how they have interpreted. So who is in office makes such a big difference, right? So the quality of judges is such a critical factor in our democracy. And that's my passion. My scholarship focuses on judges, on judicial independence, on how we select our judges. And I think the importance of good judges, the importance of the rule of law is accentuated more and more these days. The Maine law community is a close-knit community, I think more so than any other law school in the country. We consider the bench a close friend of the law school, so we're really honored to be part of the celebration of Judge Coffin. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet Judge Coffin. I've heard legendary tales of his signature introductions to the annual Coffin Lecture. We are delighted and fortunate this evening that Douglas Coffin, the judge's son, is joining us to introduce our lecturer. Douglas is an author, an illustrator, a letter cutter in stone. He hand carves letters in memorial stones and donor walls. He conducts workshops and lectures on the history of the alphabet and letter forms. Earlier in his career, Douglas was a nationally syndicated cartoonist and a graphic designer, and in fact he illustrated 2 of Judge Coffin's books, On Appeal and the lexicon of oral advocacy. Having seen some of Judge Coffin's beautiful sculptures, including the amazing tower that sits in my office today, I can say this is a great example of apple not falling far from the tree. We appreciate that Douglas and his sisters have been very supportive of and deeply engaged with the Coffin Lectures over the past 3 decades, and that they're all here tonight. So welcome and thank you, and please join me in welcoming Douglas Coffin.
Thank you very much. 4 planets needed to align before this lecture could take place. The first was Richard J. Mayman's thoughtful scholarship. His PhD from Brown brought him to the University of Southern Maine in 1971, where he wrapped up his teaching career as an eminent professor of political science. And he also taught here at the law school and in the American and New England Studies program, and was a founding faculty member at the Muskie School. His 39 years at USM were riddled with sabbaticals and leaves of absences. As a visiting fellow in England, professorships in South Africa, as a Fulbright scholar, professor of human rights, and author of books, articles, reports, opinion pieces, and international conference presentations. In the legal arena, he was president of the board of the Maine Civil Liberties for 3 years. About a third of the way through his curriculum vitae, however, I had to go back to see if he also had a law degree. And he doesn't. But virtually every single one of his writings are on legal issues. Which brings us to the second planet. Richard owns almost every biography and autobiography of every judge and every justice in England and the United States. It's not quite an obsession, but it's certainly an interest run amok. He is clearly attracted to the judicial mind and has had a lifelong ambition to write a judicial biography. The third planet was Richard sensing as he turned 70 as an educator and a researcher that he wanted one more challenge. And the fourth planet, let us be clear, was that my father, Judge Frank M. Coffin, had left behind a lifetime of writings, letters, photographs, films, recordings, speeches, 41 years of judicial opinions, 60 years of personal journals, and the accolades and testimonials of beloved clerks, friends, and colleagues. Some assembly required. And Richard Mayman is the craftsman. You'll find a generalist at work, he wrote, pursuing many topics of interest to me, both in and out of the classroom, wanting to understand them better myself, and then to tell others. It was a sentence my father could have written. Although accused of being a Renaissance man, Dad preferred the less florid generalist. And I'm sorry that my father and Richard never met, but once in passing years ago, they would have been close friends. To assemble this kit, Richard traveled to the LBJ Library in Texas and to Washington, D.C. to chase down documents that could confirm certain sequences. He also contacted all 65 of Dad's living clerks, 57 of them, and 45 in person and 12 by telephone. For research, Richard explains, variation is as of much interest as uniformity. But he didn't find much variation. Frank Coffin was the same with everyone, which is why he rings so true. Dad's clearest attempts at coming to terms came in his journals, some 60 years of dutifully recording his conversations, his reflections, his interactions, his fun, family, his travels. As a mark of his integrity and intellectuality, there is no gossip. Toward the end of his life, Dad poured through his 85 journals for more than a decade, condensing them into his memoirs, which, Richard says, omitted as much as they revealed. It's not surprising. Dad was the main character, and he was ever self-effacing, hated to toot his own horn or to be the center of attention. These are endearing characteristics, but they don't make for much of a page-turner. In the end, Dad was his own audience. Whatever his hopes of securing some notoriety, they always conflicted with his own genuine humility. He wrote for just one person. Himself, no. I think he wrote almost daily for 60 years, expressly for our distinguished speaker tonight. He wrote every single word of his journals for Richard Mayman.
Thank you, Douglas. I would have enjoyed that even if you weren't talking about me. And of course, I'm one who remembers your father's witty and graceful introductions of Coffin Lectures, in some cases better than I remember the lectures. So this was a trip down memory lane for me and for many here, I think. Good evening, all of you, and thank you for being here tonight. I was going to say something about the arduous journeys that I know some people made from the West Coast and up the East Coast, but I think there were equally arduous journeys to get here tonight from Lewiston, from South Portland, from Brunswick. So thank you for joining us. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to Nancy and Douglas and Meredith and Susan Coffin, and of course your wonderful mother, Ruth, for opening the door to me at One Ledge Road 4 years ago. You made it possible for me to not only get to know you, but also to spend some memorable afternoons talking with your mother about her beloved husband. And you gave me access to your father's unarchived papers, including, most importantly, his personal journals. I vividly remember the excitement of sitting at the judge's desk in the judge's study, reading the judge's journals for the first time. So I thank the Coffins for their generosity and their trust and their patience. I would also like to thank all the people, including many in this room, who shared their thoughts and memories of Frank Coffin with me. And to single out two in particular, those would be Don Nickel and Barbara Regalhall. It was Don who worked most closely with Frank Coffin, the politician, and Barbara, who knew him best as the judge. I so appreciate the strong encouragement that Don and Barbara gave me when I was first thinking about taking on this project, and the assistance they've provided me at every step of the way. To borrow an expression that I frequently read in Frank Coffin's journals, I have been incredibly blessed. For 4 years now, the life of Frank Coffin has occupied most of my waking moments, and lately, quite a few of my sleeping ones as well. Writing about someone's life tends to take over your own, and anyone who has spent much time with me in recent years, or even just run into me at the grocery store, I think can attest to that. I'm pretty sure I've walked into Hannaford and watched people duck behind the bananas to avoid further conversation. This is not a complaint, by the way. To be able to spend every day getting to know such a remarkable man and engaging in a kind of extended dialogue with him has been a privilege and a pleasure. Tonight, I will be describing some of what I have learned about Judge Frank Coffin, or more specifically, about the man who was a judge. But of course, not only a judge, because in his long lifetime, Frank Coffin had several distinguished careers and many notable achievements. Some of you are not familiar with that record, so I'm going to show you and I'm going to tell you and show you some of its highlights. Frank Coffin was born and raised in Lewiston, Maine. He graduated summa cum laude from Bates College, where he carried away most of the academic prizes. His most important prize, however, was Ruth Ulrich, the young woman from New Jersey he met there, who would become his spouse, supporter, and soulmate. There she is supporting him, as you can see. After 2 years at Harvard Law School, Frank Coffin shifted to the business school, where he earned the equivalent of an MBA before entering the wartime Navy and serving in the South Pacific. After the war, Coffin finished law school, and then, spurning job offers from Boston law firms, he went home to Lewiston to establish a practice. Now, there are many bright young men and women who have come to Maine or who have come back to Maine with an Ivy League degree and a game plan and a timeline for making partner or making their first million or perhaps making it to the Blaine House. That was not Frank Coffin. He had no game plan. He was never ambitious for fame or fortune, and he was content to let the future take care of itself. What he wanted, then and always, was the chance to do challenging, interesting, useful work. Nevertheless, within only a few years, he had become one of Maine's top appellate lawyers. That's Frank Coffin with future U.S. Senator Bill Hathaway, who was his associate in the law office that Frank Coffin established in Lewiston. At the same time, he was teaming up with Ed Muskie to revive, or more accurately, recreate the Maine Democratic Party, beginning with his masterminding of Muskie's surprise election as governor in 1954. Elected to Congress himself in 1956, Coffin won a coveted seat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he became well known for his tenacious, eloquent advocacy of foreign aid. With his mentor over there, Sam Rayburn. After unexpectedly losing the Maine governor's race in 1960, Coffin accepted President Kennedy's personal invitation to join the New Frontier, where he helped design and run USAID before becoming a foreign aid diplomat in Paris. In 1965, at the age of 46, Frank Coffin was appointed to the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, where he spent the second half of his life building the illustrious record that his fellow federal judges recognized in 2001 with their highest honor, the Devitt Award. Receiving the award from someone you probably know. A previous Coffin lecturer, by the way. This year marks the centennial of his birth and the 10th anniversary of his death in December 2009. So it's now time for a quiz. I've told you something about Frank Coffin based on what I've said. Do you think you could pick him out of a lineup? Judge Coffin in 2000, I think, having fun in Washington. A biography usually examines a subject's life through as many lenses as possible. It takes its basic shape from the author's interests, biases, assumptions, and values. But while this is my life of Frank Coffin, it's not exclusively mine because it draws upon many other people's perspectives as well. I've talked to over 100 of the judge's family members, friends, colleagues, and associates, including most of his clerks, all of whom told me about their Frank Coffins. Even someone as steady and grounded as Judge Coffin has more than one persona, a point he made himself in a journal entry shortly after he became Chief Judge of the First Circuit. He said, "Our judges, law clerks, court clerks, attorneys are a small, low-profile, but not insignificant society. and I manage it because that's my job. Setting hearing times, rearranging cases, assigning cases, calling conferences, talking with staff members. Apart from manager, I am also a player. I talk with my clerks, argue in conferences, interview clerk applicants. All of this is so far removed from my mental image of myself in baggy pants, sweating, painting the trim on the garage, or cutting a hollyhock root. These are various Coffin personae, some of the many hats he wore, and even another one of the robes he wore. I wanted to show you this slide and the previous one right at the outset because they depict a fundamental part of Frank Coffin's personality, his infectious enjoyment of life. Douglas told me a story about being with his mother one afternoon in his parents' later years when they heard his father arriving at the front door. Ruth said excitedly, "Frank's home," and got up to greet him. Halfway across the room, she stopped, turned to Douglas and said, "He's such fun." Many people have described the judge to me in those same words. He was such fun. He was a joy to be with. And I think that was apparent even to those of us who knew him mainly as a master of ceremonies at events like this one. Doing justice to that side of Frank Coffin would take far longer than we have tonight. So I wanted to fix these images, the images of his playful side, firmly in your minds before moving on to other matters. A moment ago, you heard the first in a series of quotes from Judge Coffin that I will be using tonight. They are drawn from the rich record of self-reflective writing he left behind. For him, the unexamined life was certainly unthinkable, if not unlivable. The idea behind my lecture title, An Examined Life, and my principal topic tonight is the interplay between my examination of Frank Coffin's life and his own intensive self-examination, particularly in his 3-volume memoir and in his more than 60 years of personal journals. John Updike once explained that he had been moved to write a memoir after hearing that someone wanted to write his biography. Updike said, "The idea seemed so repulsive that I was stimulated to put down, always with some natural hesitation and distaste, these elements of autobiography. Frank Coffin toyed for years with the idea of telling his own story, but his motive was never to steal a march on a prospective biographer because he never seriously thought that there would be one. He used to tell his daughter, Susan, that would be her job someday. And while she always assumed that he was joking, she still felt some relief, she said, when I arrived on the scene." The journals reveal that it took the judge some time to decide whether it would be worth the effort to write a memoir. To begin with, he worried that the time he spent looking backward might detract from what he always found more interesting, which was looking ahead. As he put it, "I do realize the past is part of me, and I should try to see how it is part of me. But I want to continue living, doing new things, adding to my story." He also couldn't help questioning whether his life was really important enough to write about. He once said, "I read so many biographies of people who have done far more, been far more gifted. I have not even reached the lowlands of eminence in my time that would make me of interest to many." At one point, a young friend urged him to write an autobiography as a way of inspiring others. At first, the judge was skeptical. Inspiration, he said, is an objective I hadn't thought of. Indeed, one would have to have a pretty elevated idea of oneself to pursue it. But it did stimulate him to think about putting false modesty aside and to consider whether his story might be of constructive force for others. At the same time, he couldn't help noting that other autobiographers were not so high-minded. John Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, whose memoir the judge said he enjoyed, even though it added not one cubit to my understanding of living. In the early 1990s, he finally decided to go ahead. He was a senior judge by then with a somewhat reduced workload. His second book about judging, On Appeal, had recently been published to strong reviews. His leadership of the campaign to improve judges' salaries had finally reached a successful conclusion. For his memoir, the judge chose a title, Life and Times in the Three Branches, that highlighted one of his singular achievements. He was one of only a handful of people in the 20th century to serve in all three branches of the national government. His friend Arthur Schlesinger happened to be working on an autobiography at the same time. He was a famously fast writer. It's a good joke, but it's also true that he wrote 1,000 days in only 500 days. Schlesinger's book would cover so many interesting people and events, the judge said. Mine will be the hedgehog plowing its own deep furrow. Another Coffin Lecturer, the second, 1993. At some point, Judge Coffin realized that he was really writing for a hand-picked audience that included many of the people here in this room. Family, friends, clerks, political associates, fellow judges, and a few others. Deciding not to try to place his book with a commercial publisher freed him, as he put it, to relax, not worry about what I thought others would be interested in, but just to write about what interested me. And talk about feedback loops. As the judge's past journals fed his memoir writing was generating observations and reflections for his current journals, which then found their way into later chapters of the memoir. One thing Judge Coffin never had to worry about was whether he had enough material. His life had not only been full, it had been fully documented. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that he kept every scrap of paper that ever reached his desk. All of the letters he wrote or dictated in his various careers were carbon copied, filed, and stored away. Handwritten notes and letters were either reconstructed from memory or summarized as file memos or journal entries. He was an inveterate note-taker while on the telephone, in meetings, and during oral arguments in court. All of these notes survive, along with the drawings and doodles that often accompanied them. The only records the judge ever systematically disposed of were the ones from his law practice. He once remarked that he hesitated to call what he was writing a memoir because he said, memory plays a minor role. My chief sources are papers and pictures, diaries, log books, occasional essays, and clipping albums, thanks to Mother. Well, speaking of his mother, I think the judge's archival instinct may well have been genetic. From the day Frank was born, his devoted mother, Ruth Morey Coffin, yes, Ruth, another Ruth, make of that what you will. His mother preserved just about everything that had any connection with his life, except for photographs of his father, from whom she had been bitterly divorced and whose images she painstakingly scissored out of her albums. One year, Ruth saved a memento from each day of her life with young Frankie. Her collection included a piece of sultana roll that he had brought home from a Halloween party at his grandparents' house. But you know, I'll bet it tastes as good now as it did then. After some 15 years of thought, research, and writing, the judge had indeed told his own story, all 1,037 pages and 650,000 words of it. Volumes 1 and 2, which he put in the mail on the last day of 2004, covered the first half of his life, the years before he became a judge. Once that was finished, he started immediately on a third volume dealing mostly with his career on the bench. I think most readers would agree that this volume is less compelling and revealing than the previous two, partly because he had already said what he had to say about judging in his published books, and he really hated repeating himself. But by now, the writing had become an end in itself, an enjoyable process through which he and Ruth could relive their life together. It engaged him literally to the end. The very last words Judge Coffin ever wrote were these, jotted in a pocket diary on November 19th, 2009, 2 days before he suffered an aortic aneurysm. Finished edit of chapter 9 and redid part of summing up, cutting out duplications. Ruth's good criticism. He never saw his third volume in its finished form. Nancy took charge of having it printed and distributed to his previous recipients. For those fortunate enough to have been on that mailing list, it was a gift to be cherished. For the biographer, however, such a memoir is both a gift and a challenge. How does one write about someone who has already told his life story? When a political scientist named Bruce Murphy set out to write a biography of Justice William O. Douglas, he soon discovered that very little of what the justice had written about himself could be corroborated. It turned out that Douglas had suppressed much of the real evidence of his life and fabricated a lot more. So Murphy's book is by far the most interesting of the several Douglas biographies, a character study of a man who felt compelled to invent a semi-fictional version of himself for public viewing. There is the justice. This is the evening before Judge Coffin became Judge Coffin, the evening before his induction in November of 1965. Douglas telling him a tall tale, no doubt. I never had the Douglas problem. He simply did not have it in him to tamper with the evidence. The essential details of his memoir line up squarely with his contemporaneous journal accounts and other available documentation. So my problem as a biographer was different from Murphy's, but it was still a problem. Obviously, I was not interested in simply recapitulating Judge Coffin's story, but what could I add to it? Or, just as importantly, given its length, what should I subtract from it? How could the memoir help me produce my life of Frank Coffin? Well, first, I used the memoir less as a source of facts than as a source of clues to his character, as revealed through what the judge thought was worth recounting. Next, I listened hard for the memoir's silences, trying to tune my ear to what was not there, picking up on events and issues the judge had not written about or had moved past with little elaboration. Here, of course, having access to the journals was crucial because they contained much more emotional content than the memoir on subjects like the judge's relationship with his father, who was largely absent from his life. I also tried to go not only deeper than the memoir, but also wider. A biographer can start with the single lens that the memoirist uses, but can then add other points of view. For example, when the judge asked his old friend Don Nickel to read parts of the memoir dealing with their joint political projects, he did not ask Don to compare the experience of working with him to that of working with Ed Muskie, as I did. The judge did not ask his clerks how their association with him had influenced their lives and careers, as I did. Nor did he ask his fellow judges about his impact on the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, as I did. To be accurate, the judge did pay close attention to one other perspective besides his own. Ruth Coffin, edited her husband's entire manuscript, adding her own recollections and sometimes correcting his. Her editorial comments, usually made on yellow Post-it notes, make for such delightful reading that I'd like to share just a couple of them with you. Reacting to the judge's description of his departure for Harvard Law School, Ruth wrote, "Your loyal mother drove you to Cambridge. No easy trip. You and I are still not sure of the way." "I don't like your approach that you were a typical law student. You were not typical. You were different, and it shows in this tale. This seemed much ado about nothing. I'm not sure your cooking stories are worth memorializing." And I like this quote because it tells about you. I'd like to say at this point that my wife, Susan, has played the same role for me as editor-in-chief on this lecture and on my book as Ruth did for Judge Coffin. I know that I am not as gracious about accepting criticism as Judge Coffin was, but I am just as grateful as he was to Ruth for her help. The judge took Ruth's comments very seriously, and he usually followed her suggestions, but she did not press him to discuss uncomfortable subjects. For example, when I had the opportunity to question Ruth about Frank's relationship with his father, it was obvious that we were entering territory that she had not visited for years. Finally, the most important way for me to augment what I found in the memoir was by doing my own research at sites like the Kennedy and Johnson Presidential Libraries and the National Archives. Many people in this room know something about the protracted standoff between President Johnson and Senator Muskie over Frank Coffin's Circuit Court nomination in 1965. At the LBJ Library, I found documents that cast more light on the Texas-sized grudge that LBJ was still nursing at that point against Frank Coffin 4 years after their brief but fateful encounter. Those materials helped me piece together what I believe to be the definitive nomination story. I know there are lots of them floating around, but I would like to think I've got it. And to add my thoughts about what the president might have expected from Senator Muskie in return for finally letting the nomination go forward. This is apparently, this is the Oval Office meeting at which the president finally told the senator that he would allow the nomination to happen. To Ed Muskie, reasoning together. There was some new material closer at hand. For example, I wanted to learn more about the aborted nomination of Frank Coffin to be ambassador to Panama, which President Kennedy had announced but had not yet signed off on before he left for Dallas on November 20th, 1963. In an online archive, I found recordings made in the Oval Office that December. President Johnson can be heard complaining to a staff member about his earlier encounter with Frank Coffin when Coffin, quote, told me I don't know what the hell I'm talking about in front of 50 guests, unquote. The way Frank Coffin remembered, there were only a couple of witnesses to their exchange. One of them, by the way, was Arthur Schlesinger. Now, you would think that Arthur Schlesinger, the court historian of the Kennedy administration, would have been taking notes. But when Frank Coffin asked him years later what he remembered about the incident, he remembered nothing. He was no help whatsoever. And I think if there were one thing that I would love to explore further with Judge Coffin, it would be that episode. Well, Johnson can also be heard on tape a couple of days later instructing Secretary of State Rusk, this is 1963 now, to find Coffin, quote, the most insignificant, smallest ambassadorship we can, unquote. Hearing this, I felt the way Robert Caro must feel whenever he unearths another example of LBJ's pettiness and petulance. This is the meeting, the very brief meeting that took place after Frank Coffin accepted the consolation prize that the president offered, only really to appease Senator Muskie of a diplomatic position in Paris. And then there were the materials that the judge knew about but simply did not use in his memoir. In the USM archive, I found some papers relating to interactions between Chief Judge Coffin and District Judge Charles Wyzanski of Boston back in the early 1970s. Clipped to the manila envelope containing these papers was a handwritten note from Judge Coffin's longtime secretary, Midge Bouvier, suggesting that he read them over and then throw them in the fireplace, lest they fall into the wrong hands. The judge did not take Midge's advice, and I don't know whether he would have considered mine to be the wrong hands, but I did use the papers because they illustrated so well the judge's skill in dealing with some of his colleagues' prickly personalities. Judge Coffin once said that as far as he was concerned, once his memoir was finished, all of those boxes of saved materials would have served their intended purpose and could be destroyed without any loss to the world. But he did not destroy them. He did not instruct his family to burn his notebooks, as Justice Hugo Black did on his deathbed. He did not lock up his papers for 50 years, as Justice David Souter has recently done. Instead, Judge Coffin gave his judicial papers to the University of Maine Law School and his political and some personal materials to the University of Southern Maine. The only stated restriction on their use was the reasonable one that certain materials about other judges not be made public until 10 years after his or the other judge's death, whichever came later. Although the Coffin family imposed no specific rules on my use of the journals, I have observed the same restriction with regard to their contents. This eliminated some interesting material about a few of the judge's First Circuit contemporaries, but there was still a lot left to work with. The judge was an avid reader of biographies, but he frequently complained that they did not supply enough details about the subject's personal life. I think he and I must read different biographies because, of course, there are plenty out there. In his otherwise positive review of Gerald Gunther's biography of Judge Learned Hand, Judge Coffin mentioned his regret about one other area, a rather vast one, he said, where the reader may well wish he knew more. That is the private side of Learned Hand. My book certainly does not neglect Frank Coffin's private side. While his work, obviously, was important in his life, it was not his whole life. He was a workhorse, but he was not a workaholic. Other important dimensions of his life included his family, his friends, painting, sculpting, creative writing, running, boating, traveling, summering at his beloved cottage in South Harpswell, and his various roles off the court, all of which I have tried to give their due. I have no doubt that Frank Coffin left behind a more comprehensive written record of his work and his life than any judge ever has. In addition to his Russian novel-length autobiography, there are 4 books, scores of articles and book chapters, and hundreds of speeches. Barbara and Chief Justice Dan Wathen collected around 160 Coffin speeches delivered just during his years as a judge. There are hundreds more before that. On the bench, he wrote over 1,300 signed opinions and hundreds more that were unsigned. In the course of his various careers, there were thousands of letters and countless reports, memoranda, position papers, statements for congressional committees, and the like. They all survive. And we must not forget his creative writing, a thick file that includes poems, short stories, a play draft, a puppet show script, and what he called whimsy, the humorous Christmas letters and the winter solstice declamations that he wrote to entertain family and friends. All these writings are windows into Frank Coffin's capacious mind. Unlike most of today's Supreme Court nominees, here was a judge who did leave a paper trail. And if you're wondering how he did all that writing, apparently he could write anywhere. Office, summer house, whatever. He wrote, he had to write. And then there are the journals, the 85 bound volumes spanning the judge's 41-year judicial career and his 4 years of retirement. He also journalized intermittently before that, but those journals, like so many other people's, certainly like mine, petered out as they were overtaken by events that there was simply no time to record. But once Coffin became a judge and developed a regular, almost metronomic routine, he was able to maintain an uninterrupted flow. His method was to make cryptic notes every day, usually in a small pocket diary, but also on note cards, the backs of envelopes, boarding passes, whatever was at hand. Now, for most people, those notes would constitute the journal. But for Frank Coffin, they were simply the first draft of the journal. Every couple of weeks, usually on a Sunday afternoon, he would spend several hours going through his notes and expanding them into a narrative describing and reflecting on major events. The writing would be fluid and graceful, sometimes even lyrical, composed in complete sentences and full paragraphs. The entries were written in the judge's tiny but highly legible hand, with hardly a word ever crossed out. Many read like long, leisurely letters to a close friend or relative. They were a real pleasure for me to read and transcribe, but it was absorbing and time-consuming work. Covering about 1 year per week, it took me 12 full months to go through the journals of his judicial years and several more months for the earlier journals. Robert Caro has said that the most valuable piece of advice he ever received back when he was an investigative reporter was turn every page. Turning every page of the Coffin Journals revealed, for me, a rich interior life that I think will distinguish this biography from that of any other judge. Well, that's how the judge kept his journal, but the more interesting question is, why did he keep them? The novelist, essayist Thomas Maiman has written an insightful book about people and their journals titled A Book of One's Own. Maiman read scores of journals kept by a wide variety of people in many different eras, and then devised a typology of journalizing styles. I think that two of his categories help explain why Frank Coffin devoted so much time and effort to his journals. The journal keepers Maiman calls chroniclers wish, for many different reasons, to create a record of their life and times. In the judge's case, I think the compulsion to chronicle had its roots in his need to hold himself accountable. Keeping a journal was a way of answering for himself to himself. His daily record of events provided assurance that he was not wasting precious time, that his days were filled with productive and worthwhile activities. For Frank Coffin, using time wisely and well was always very important. Douglas has told me about his father's 20-minute rule, his insistence that 20 minutes was plenty of time to accomplish something. According to Douglas, much of his father's wood sculpting was done this way, on the fly. The judge's urge to chronicle events was also connected, I think, to his desire to experience those events to the utmost. As he once explained, I try to keep at this, feeling that some record of feelings and events is a way of extending life, once in the thought and reflection that go into the writing, and again in the later rereading and reflection. It's clearing the deck for the next few weeks of life. Still, he did sometimes ask himself whether the end justified the means. Is it worth 2 to 3 hours every 2 weeks to record my doings and a few thinkings and feelings, he once asked. He admitted that he was not sure. But he added, I would stack it against 2 to 3 hours of watching sports on TV, which is something he never did, except for the Olympics. And once or twice when the Red Sox were in the World Series, I think only so he would have conversation to make with his clerks the next day. Well, in addition to being a chronicle of events, the Coffin Journals also fit neatly into a second Maiman category, those kept by what Maiman calls pilgrims, who set out in their books to discover who they really are, to discover their full potential, spiritual and otherwise. Maiman considers pilgrims a breed apart from chroniclers, but in Frank Coffin's case, I see the two impulses as complementary. His record-keeping was not an end in itself, but a way of gauging his progress toward fulfilling his potential. He kept track so he could keep stock. From time to time, he would chide himself for cluttering up his pages with too much trivia and vow to make his entries sparer but more substantive. While his writing did grow leaner over time, he never really succeeded in eliminating the minutiae because that was the raw material out of which he would shape more profound reflections. As I read through the journals, extracting quotable passages, I created a category I called Deep Thoughts, the judge's musings on various aspects of his life. That file adds up to 45,000 words, and that does not include another 10,000 words he devoted exclusively to his thoughts on religion, and easily another 10,000 or so consisting of shorter takes on a wide variety of subjects, from aging to eating to leadership to self-confidence to Vietnam to, well, whatever, you name it. Many of the judge's deep thoughts were inspired by calendar milestones, like the beginning of a new year or a birthday or a significant anniversary. On one of the last days of 1952, as he was in the process of transferring his law practice from Lewiston to Portland, he noted that he was giving up most of his leadership positions in his hometown, the Elks, the Chamber of Commerce, the Community Chest, without having any clear idea of what would take their place. In a passage that reflects perhaps a weakness for metaphors that I think he later overcame, he wrote, "A well-defined rut is abandoned for a trek across a trackless meadow. What the next rut will look like is not at all clear at the moment. We are living in something approaching a vacuum. We are not so much a part of Lewiston, and we are in no way a part of Portland. The solitariness is delightful because this community, like all small communities, was becoming too possessive. And there is the inescapable fact that the law is a jealous mistress and life was in danger of becoming a condition of almost complete servitude." Because Frank Coffin never had a long-term game plan, he had no inkling that the vacuum he was talking about would soon be filled by politics. Before long, he and Ed Muskie would be taking their first steps toward bringing the Maine Democratic Party to life. Over time, he expressed both the satisfactions and the frustrations of that project as deep thoughts. Let's fast forward now to New Year's 1959, when Congressman Coffin was about to start his second term. He thought the year would be of momentous significance. He said, "It will be the end of 4 decades of living for me." He was about to turn 40. "Life has been full and rich, yet I still feel I am just beginning. But the exhilaration of apprenticeship is tempered by the haunting question, what is to be my contribution to my times? I still do not know." 5 years later, as he finished what had been a very frustrating experience in the executive branch, Coffin still did not know what that contribution would be. But he was about to find out, as his hard-won appointment as a federal circuit judge turned out to be a close to perfect fit for his talents, energies, and ambitions. But even then, Coffin, the relentless self-improver, could not help thinking that he might be doing even more with his life. He wrote this after his first few months on the bench. "As I face the new year, my mind is in a muddle. I am a creature of desires that outrun my energies. I desire to be a better judge than merely a good judge. That may be both arrogant and a contradiction in terms, for is not the good judge a sufficient goal? I desire to be creative, both in painting and in writing, and here, both in prose and poetry. I desire to play a role in stirring the national will to support foreign aid, a mammoth aspiration. I desire to sharpen my appreciation of this world's wonders. I desire to be a better husband, father, son, and companion. I desire to deepen my feeling for lack of a better expression, sources of spiritual peace and power. As this passage makes clear, Frank Coffin's pilgrimage always had an inner as well as an outer dimension. While he wanted to become a better judge, he never wanted to be only a judge. He aspired to live a balanced life, not to define himself solely in terms of his professional activities. He once wrote of reaching the rarefied level where I might gain new insights, new serenity, new philosophical concepts, perhaps even new religious commitments. All these levels of striving are my ways of trying to become a whole person, to fulfill my potential as a human being, to discover myself. Where religion was concerned, he never stopped being a seeker, moving gradually over the years from conventional Christianity to something more like open-minded secular humanism. The judge often wrote about savoring, which he defined as doing certain things slowly, deliberately, thinkingly, in reflecting on the doing, and often in putting the reflection into words, oral or written. It pleases me to report that as he got older, he got better and better at savoring. His journal entries are more and more likely to express his contentment with life than the need to be doing more with it. Here's one such passage written in his late 70s. In a sense, I am a pure hedonist these days. Everything is a treat, except the virus, he adds. I am truly living in a garden of delights. I, who have usually been accompanied by a persistent Puritan work ethic conscience, have at last put some distance between me and that nagging voice. I suspect that if a job appeared that needed to be done and that I could do very well, I might yield, but I am content to let sleeping jobs lie. But I have to point out that at the time, Frank Coffin was not only an active senior judge, but he was anything but idle off the bench. He was working closely with the Governance Institute, the organization he and Robert Katzman had founded to improve relations between the judicial and legislative branches. Closer to home, he was providing vigorous leadership to the Justice Action Group to increase access to legal services for the poor. And he was working with Chief Justice Wathen on the Dirigo project to promote citizen involvement in Maine's courts. But for him, that was still a relatively low gear, leaving plenty of time to record moments of savoring, such as the following. First, a reflection on what has become a precious time of day for me. A half hour or so in the wingback chair by the bay window, when it is still light, savoring a drink, reading Victor Hugo, listening to a venerable record, feeling luxuriantly relaxed after exercising, and occasionally looking out at a gray-pink sky with a few small clouds, and then a silver moon rising over Cushing. This, by the way, is the view, not at that time of day, but this is the view from the judge's window. A trawler, homeward bound, passes the mid-channel buoy. Portland Head is blinking, and white surf breaks on a black shore with faded gray and cream houses in the background. I made a note of this ritual. I call it anteroom to heaven. I cannot leave the subject of savoring without adding a few words, or a few of the judge's words, about his wife, Ruth. If there was one blessing that he did not find hard to stop and appreciate, it was Ruth. He's looking very smug there, and he has every reason to. She loomed just as large in his journal as she did in his life. The Coffin children have told me that their father was not especially demonstrative, but in his journal, he often rhapsodizes about what Ruth means to him. Once, when she was hospitalized for a few days, he was moved to write, "Occasionally during this time, I found myself wondering how life would be if I didn't have Ruth. I realized with a sense of acute shock that I would have a very hard time in finding life worthwhile. I cannot imagine continuing to work away at cases or doing anything else I love to do." Once, after writing a detailed account of a beach holiday in Puerto Rico, he added this postscript, "As I reflect, I realize that I have not treated the heart and soul of this blissful adventure, Ruth. She is so much a part of me that I never describe her. She is not an external. Yet she is part of every event and scene I have described. On our morning walks, she strides ahead of me, sloppy hat sitting squarely on her head, shoulders square, arms swinging determinedly. Her enthusiasm and laugh of triumph as she once more finds a diminishing Venus in the brightening sky are infectious. I am glad that we shared this, as everything else, so completely." Of the scores of passages about Ruth that I could quote to you, here is just one more written when Frank Coffin was 88 and no longer an active judge. He writes, "So the day was busy, and I realize it is a new role for me, being a replacement for much of Ruth's sight." She had macular degeneration. "She does so well, poring over the mail with a magnifying glass, teasing out crossword puzzles, puzzling over handwritten directions for pancake mix, occasionally missing a receptacle and pouring coffee, dark liquid and dark countertop. And I rejoice when she says, 'You are so good to me.' It is a blessing to be able to help and to have her still with me." I think this may be the last photo of Frank and Ruth Coffin together, taken around his 90th birthday in the summer of 2009. Ruth would have been 89 that same month. In Frank Coffin's personal journals, one finds many of the same qualities that characterize his judicial opinions: diligence and discipline, acute self-awareness, scrupulous attention to facts and to details, and devotion to clear writing. These are all hallmarks of his journals and his opinions. And just as his journals were more than cryptic summaries of daily events, his judicial opinions were never simply statements of a result. Rather, they would explain in detail how the court, or at least how he, had reached the decision. Professor Mel Czar of the University of Maine Law School has made this point, I think, very well. He said, "A Judge Coffin opinion is a pleasure to read because its hallmark is that he will confront the difficulties. He will not sweep them under the rug or conceal them in any way. He will tell you that it doesn't all come out neatly, that there were some loose ends and some difficulties in the case, and he will deal with them honestly. Instead of someone trying to justify a result, you can witness the workings of an active mind trying fairly to reach a just result, a legal result." In sum, I see the judge's journals as windows through which his essential character can be closely examined. By combining rich description and thoughtful reflection, they illustrate his extraordinary capacity to link the real and the ideal, the material and the metaphysical. Perhaps this explains his talent for sculpting in both words and wood. Frank Coffin clearly had what psychologists call an integrated personality, a harmonious combination of abilities, interests, goals, and behaviors. The personal virtues he cultivated over a lifetime, honesty, authenticity, self-knowledge, emotional intelligence, were embedded in everything he did, including, most importantly, his judging. I'm going to close by addressing three questions I've frequently been asked since beginning this project. The first is, when will it be finished? I've stopped projecting a specific date, and I now answer the way my hero, Robert Caro, does. Truth takes time. The second question is, will this be a warts and all biography? No, because Frank Coffin did not have warts. And I know this because he would record the results of each semi-annual physical with this, in the same detail he used in recording everything else. He would end each organ recital with an incantation of gratitude for his continuing good health. I particularly like this one. And to cap my blessings, he did not explore my prostate. I was beatific, he says. Of course, the judge, like all of us, had weaknesses, limitations, foibles, and blind spots, though I have to say, far fewer than many of us. A challenge for any biographer is to deal candidly with such issues without giving them more weight than they deserve. Too often, I think, the exception to the rule gets more attention than the rule itself. The book will contain some surprises, but no one should expect any shameful secrets. No illicit wartime romances, no second families living in the DC suburbs. Frank Coffin did have a rosebud, though, a childhood artifact like the toy sled in Citizen Kane that symbolized a lifelong quest by its owner. And no, it wasn't that fossilized sultana roll that I showed you. And finding it required no super sleuthing on my part because the judge revealed it himself in his first volume of the memoir. He wrote this: "In writing this, I went up to the attic and exhumed my own Boy Scout handbook, printed in December 1930. I still touch it lovingly. I was wondering if something I thought I remembered was there. It was. On page 31 was the oath of the Athenian young man. In it, the oath taker promises to, quote, fight for the ideals and sacred things of the city both alone and with the many, and to strive unceasingly to quicken the public's sense of civic duty, and to transmit this city greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us." And then he adds, "Somehow this simple thought stuck and became part of my creed. Simple creed from a simple age? Perhaps. But I can't change my past, and I wouldn't want to." That is Frank Coffin's own origin story of his lifelong commitment to public service. And I think there is no single passage in all of his writing that speaks more simply or more powerfully to a life well-examined, well-understood, and well-lived. And finally, the most important question I've been asked is, why should I read your book? And I apologize for having no one-sentence response for this one, but if you can bear with me for just about 2 minutes, I'll give you my answer and then I'll be finished. I think appellate judges have perhaps the hardest job in American public life. We, the people, have always been conflicted and are often confused about what we want from them. We want them to apply laws consistently and fairly, of course, and even at times to decide to tell us what those laws really mean. But we have also given judges the power not to apply laws if they find them to be at odds with a command or prohibition in our basic law, our Constitution. Judicial review is democracy's way of covering its bet. Whenever such decisions involve major policy questions, as today they usually do, it is inevitable that around half of the public will be unhappy with the outcome, and that discontent will lead to accusations of judicial despotism and denunciation of judges as politicians in robes. The following week, the other half of the people may be saying exactly the same thing. And some weeks everybody is saying it, though usually about different judges. It's not a pretty picture, but I think it is an unavoidable feature of life in a constitutional democracy. Frank Coffin understood this tricky terrain and navigated it as well as any judge ever has. Not only could he navigate it, he drew roadmaps for others to follow. His written opinions, with their unusual clarity and candor, were guides for deciding individual cases. His books are comprehensive descriptions and explanations of the work of appellate judges. They also serve as instruction manuals for his fellow judges and are still required reading and training seminars for new state and federal judges. Refuting myths about judicial supremacy on the one hand and judicial impotence on the other, Judge Coffin drew a realistic picture of what judges do and how and why they do it. He wrote those books in the sincere belief that better understanding of what judging is and is not would increase public acceptance and support of judicial decisions, even unpopular ones. There's a chapter in my book dealing with Coffin's time in the House of Representatives titled Textbook Congressman. Remarkably enough, that same man was also a textbook judge. In fact, he wrote one of the textbooks. In essence, my book is an examination of how Frank Coffin developed and then deployed his understanding of the unique demands and challenges of judging. One of its key ingredients was his extensive background in government at all levels, local, state, national, international. Before becoming a judge, Frank Coffin never shrank from calling himself a politician. He regarded politics as a worthy enterprise, sometimes even a noble one. And the record shows that he was very good at it. After donning his judicial robes, he scrupulously avoided partisan politics, but continued to put his political skills and sensibilities to good use. During his 11 years as Chief Judge of the First Circuit, those qualities contributed to his court's high levels of both productivity and collegiality. But Judge Coffin was more than simply a gifted group leader. He understood macro as well as micro politics. He was acutely aware that the judiciary is one part of a complex political organism. Although he was never results-oriented in the conventional and pejorative sense, he was always results-conscious. He thought long and hard about how his decisions would play out in the real world of school boards, draft boards, prison officials, prosecutors, and police. Out of that thinking grew the concept he called workability. Unlike some judges who deal with real-world political pressures by becoming restrained to the point of paralysis, Judge Coffin did not hesitate to take a directive role when he thought it was appropriate. But whenever he imposed new duties on public officials or insisted that existing duties be more faithfully executed, he would strive for clarity and indeed transparency. He would explain precisely and in detail what interests were being protected and why. And without compromising on any basic principles, he would take pains to ensure that government officials were not so hamstrung by red tape that they could not do their jobs properly. He wanted his decisions to be workable. He believed that judges should demonstrate, in Bill Kelly's words, a level of modesty and respect for the demands on other institutions that is neither dismissive nor blindly deferential. Judge Coffin's sure feel for American politics made him especially mindful of the role of the judiciary as the balance wheel of our system, the institution we rely upon to resolve boundary disputes among the branches and between state and national government, and to check government's excesses while also ensuring its capacity to perform essential functions. Today, public confidence in the judiciary is low and getting lower, and no wonder. The selection of our judges has been reduced to the political equivalent of let's make a deal, or maybe The Apprentice. Definitely The Apprentice. Many people seem to be giving up on the possibility of finding people well qualified by intellect, experience, and character to assume the challenges of judging. So I hope my Frank Coffin story will be read as an antidote to such cynicism and hopelessness, as a salutary reminder of what a judge can do and can be. The world may not be teeming with Judge Frank Coffins, but he still can serve as a guide, a model, and an inspiration for sitting judges, for those who might become judges, and for the rest of us whose fates are in the hands of judges. I hope my book will be read as the story of an exemplary, an ideal, and I'll go ahead and say it, the ideal American judge. Thank you.
I think we have a few minutes for some questions. We have some microphones that are lined up. If you mind coming up and address them to Richard.
Okay, good night. I've said my piece. What's your price point? Really? Okay.
Dick, I want to say I thought that was just terrific.
Thank you.
I am grateful for every moment I was here. Grateful for every moment I was here. Grateful to hear about you from Frank's son, and really moved and inspired by your presentation. So that's what I think.
All right, thank you. Okay. Read the book for the other. Oh, okay. Yes.
So, what did LBJ extract from Muskie?
I don't know that he extracted anything, but I think he was looking for loyalty. He was looking for a quid pro quo. That was LBJ. LBJ was a transactional politician. He didn't give up anything without getting or expecting to get something. Of course, Muskie, we're talking about 1965, and Muskie was an important senator at that point. He was very important to LBJ's Great Society program. He had pushed Muskie as far as he could go, he knew that. But before he gave up the prize that Muskie was trying to win, the judgeship, he was going to remind the senator of how deeply hurt he had been by Frank Coffin's telling him, "Oh no, Mr. Vice President, you're wrong." That is it. That's the statement that he made to LBJ at this chance encounter at a cocktail party, a diplomatic reception in 1961, that led to, I'm sure, I don't know if it was a lifelong enmity, but it was certainly volcanic. Some of the documents I found at the LBJ library make it clear that if you mentioned Frank Coffin's name around LBJ between 1961 and 1965 anyway, you were going to hear about that incident again. Go figure. But I think that LBJ thought that he was, well, I think LBJ was looking for loyalty, particularly maybe on Vietnam. And I'm not familiar enough with the ins and outs of Senator Muskie's record to be able to go any further than that. But I think that's what he was looking for. Harvey?
Respecting the privacy of what won't be in your book. In terms of what will be in your book, what would you believe is the most difficult thing that Judge Coffin faced during his time as a judge?
Well, Judge Coffin said it was the draft cases. The first, between the late 60s and the late 70s, the First Circuit decided about 50 draft cases and decided them in most cases against the draftee. I'm just going by what the judge once told a group of students at Bowdoin, that those were the hardest decisions he had to make, because he did not consider these young men criminals, but he did consider them, in some cases, as lawbreakers. If there was a way out, he would entertain it. But most of these cases, by the time they got to him, didn't offer too many options.
Who was the ceiling on the war?
Complicated. He once said that the issue, he said later on in the 80s, when he was interviewed about his relationship with Senator Muskie, he was asked, were there any issues on which you and the senator differed? And at first he said no, we were on the same page on just about every important issue. And then he reconsidered that and he said, no, I would say the war. Now, you may remember that Senator Muskie probably lost the 1972 Democratic nomination because he was not perceived as being sufficiently anti-war. There were other reasons, but that was certainly a major one. That ground, of course, was occupied by George McGovern and others. And I took from that, because the judge was really very reticent about this. He didn't have a lot to say about Vietnam. He did, however, write an opinion which, for reasons I've never been able to understand, has not gotten the sort of attention that I would have expected it to. Massachusetts versus Laird, 1972, he upheld the constitutionality of the Vietnam War. And it's a lucid and compelling opinion, essentially based not on any provision of the Constitution, but on American history, suggesting that Vietnam was just one more example of cooperation between the executive and the legislative branches in the absence of a declaration of war. I'm not giving the decision its due, but essentially he could find no argument for its unconstitutionality. He said maybe if Congress was challenging its constitutionality, we would feel differently. But Congress seems to be cooperating with the president. So he saw no constitutional issue in that. I think he did, over time, like many, many people, become disenchanted with the war. And even in the 1950s and 60s, while he was a man of his times, he was a Cold War liberal in many respects, but he was also, remember, probably the chief advocate for foreign aid in that period as an alternative to military aid. It always bothered him greatly that whenever administrations would talk about how much money was going overseas, they were including military aid, the weapons that we were selling them. And he said, that's not what I would consider foreign aid. You know, I'm talking about economic aid. And so he was never really in the thrall of the Pentagon the way many people were, but I don't think he saw Vietnam coming any sooner than many people did, or turning into what it was. So, open-ended question. or answer anyway.
Did the judge write about,
Okay, one.
did the judge write about impeachment of Richard Nixon, and did he have a view?
I don't think he did. I don't think he did. He didn't like Nixon. He would, in his journal, he would often, he would write on one page, and the opposite side, the left side would be blank, you know, the other side of the previous page. But whenever he had political views to express, he'd write them on the right side, on the left side. And he was a lifelong Democrat. He had no time for Nixon. He had no time for Reagan. But he also wasn't in love with a lot of the Democratic presidential candidates or presidents either. So, but no, I don't remember anything specific about impeachment.
Well, if
Sorry.
we want to be invited back to the museum, we have to clear out the space, so thank you once again.